Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Mark Stevens of Links Technology Partners. I want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. It's part of our ongoing educational series. Today, we're going to be covering the top cloud threats and solutions, and we've identified 9 key threats. I'd like to introduce Bobby Dominguez, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Links Technology. He'll be going through this webinar. We should run about 30 minutes. And if you'd like, I'd want to point you to the chat pod in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to ask any questions you have. There is downloadable content as well, but feel free to ask any questions during the course of the webinar. We'll get to what we can, and if your questions are not answered in the course of this webinar, we'll follow up with an email to you. But with that, let me hand it off to Bobby Dominguez.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. This is going to be Cloud 9, and Cloud 9 is typically referred to as a state of euphoria. Everybody's running to the cloud. Everybody's using the cloud, whether they realize it or not, whether it's a hybrid cloud, a true cloud service such as software as a service. You have platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, a variety of different definitions. In this talk, I'm going to include all of those as under the cloud definition. What I want to do is not get stuck in the semantics. Basically, anything that is a network, a database, an application, infrastructure, a platform, or any set of services that you leverage technologies that you do not directly own or physically control. It's an environment in which you may not know where the physical devices reside, and the only thing you may know is the data that you're supplying to that cloud and the people that are accessing that cloud, typically from your organization or partners from your organization. Again, my cloud definition is going to be anything that leverages a third party to supply a portion of the technology or services that you're using. And in this case, the cloud that I'm talking about are those that are provided across public networks, such as the internet. They don't include dedicated circuits and black fiber type circuits that provide services to another company directly, and they're providing you a service out of their own personal data center where you do know who controls the assets and you do know who controls that data center. So with that said, let me give you also a little bit of background. Earlier this year, I read the Cloud Security Alliance came out with a Dirty Dozen where they had 12 threats out there that were prominent in the cloud and things that they were seeing that were actually being attacked, different aspects of the cloud. What I saw that was missing was the actual solutions. How do you apply those solutions to those threats? And I wanted to write something that really addressed the threats associated with the cloud, but also the solutions that you would apply. What's practical, what's out there. By no means am I endorsing any particular product or service. Your mileage may vary depending on how you use it and what your particular use case is. This is just some research that you could use and leverage, to help you have a more robust security for your cloud. So jumping right in, the number one problem in the cloud is compromised credentials and broken authentication. What we see happening in a lot of cases is obviously that everybody knows passwords are weak, and you have different services out there that are providing, requesting you to use complex passwords, a very long password, that you don't share your passwords across platforms. The topic of passwords has been beaten to death, but yet a lot of services rely on passwords. They rely on passwords not only from their end users, but they rely on passwords and other types of authentication techniques, such as certificates or secure keys for encryption. All of these allow authentication either between an end user or between applications when you have applications exchanging information in the cloud. All of these require some level of saying, I am who I am. The problem with that is that, if you're using passwords, they can be broken. If you're using keys and certificates, certificates can be spoofed, and keys that don't rotate can be compromised. So it's important as part of your technique, at your authentication technique, when you roll out cloud applications, that you use certificates and keys that you periodically change and you periodically manage. I've seen a lot of environments get taken down very simply because their keys expired, their certificates expire, and they didn't know about it. And all of a sudden, customers are getting broken pages. The browsers are popping up messages saying this is an insecure site. And you don't want that negative customer experience. So if you're not managing your keys, if you're not managing your certificates proactively and know what's out there, and in addition are using a trustworthy and reputable certificate authority, you may run into these problems with the certificates that you use. With passwords, the best solution there is some level of multi-factor authentication. They have one-time passwords. There's a variety of applications out there that will provide those one-time passwords, such as Google Authenticator. And there are also company enterprise-wide types of solutions out there that provide strong key management, certificate management. Some of those vendors include Okta, Duo Security, Venafi. I know Trend Micro does something similar in that area. Another area of compromised credentials is the segregation of duties. If you're not segregating duties with regards to your administrative consoles, and in some applications you are using a consumer-based application to service your enterprise, not to denigrate them, and now Dropbox has come up with an enterprise model, but originally when Dropbox came out and you saw a lot of companies embracing it, or Shadow IT embracing it, the problem with Dropbox was that it was a consumer product and not an enterprise product. So you didn't have the keys, or I'm sorry, the accounts properly segregated. The individual who went in is the individual who could manage that account. That's changing nowadays, so you do have a higher level of segregation. But it's also important that even if you do have an enterprise application, and let's say that you're doing some level of key management. I'll give you another example. Box has wonderful encryption whenever you upload data to their environment. The only problem with that is that Box is doing the encryption for you with keys that they maintain. So that's another separation of duties that is not taking place there. You should be managing those keys. Box should not know those keys. Those keys should be handled in a manner where that if Box gets compromised, or you have a malicious person inside of Box that is using these keys, they can't get access to your data. So the ultimate control is going to be you being able to provide your end users with an authentication mechanism that is more secure than a password, the two-factor authentication, where you get a text to your phone or smart cards, one-time passwords, other types of techniques. You have to rotate those keys and those passwords on a regular basis. You have to separate your duties. That means duties in terms of administrative access and user access, but also duties in terms of what you do as a company and what the cloud provider does. And finally, as a best practice, you should be looking at your authentication mechanisms and conducting analysis of methods that people can bypass those authentication mechanisms and that separation of duties. That should be part of your penetration testing. That should be part of your regular testing. Moving on, we have the hacked interfaces and APIs. And one thing, by the way, that you're going to see across as we move through these different types of threats, the threats carry forward and they build on each other. None of these are one thing alone that you resolve. You resolve them all as a whole, primarily because a particular threat can result in multiple ways of exploitation. And there's also multiple ways to not only stop the threat, close the vulnerability, or stop a particular exploit. So that's why you're going to see a lot of redundancy. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because there is redundancy in these. It's just a matter of how these threats are applied that I want to make sure that it's clear and how the solution applies to that specific threat. So hopefully you won't feel like this is too redundant, but just understand that the themes are going to be very closely tied together. So APIs, very important, and it's probably the most misunderstood portion of cloud applications. APIs are what enable applications to talk to each other. When you have a mobile device with an app on it, it is using an API talking to a backend server that has an open interface that understands the information that's coming down from the mobile device. Those devices could be using a variety of different techniques, JSON, RESTful architecture. Really, they're all based on a type of XML, a name value pair that helps the application on the server respond and do things, and then send a response back to the application on your phone or whatever that other remote device is, and you have the results that you want. Well, there's an inherent trust between at the application layer that says the information I'm receiving from that mobile device or from that remote device into the server is a valid transmitter, that the information I'm receiving is from someone that I have a trust relationship with, whether that's another software package, because you see that, for instance, you join GitHub, you can attach a ton of different plugins. All those plugins authenticate to each other, and they use that by the API interface. So the attackers will target that trust mechanism between those applications through the API layer. One of the most common methods used is that they compromise the certificate. They spoof the certificate. The certificates provide various types of functions. They provide encryption, they provide authentication, and then they also provide non-repudiation. It just depends on how that certificate was set up. The non-repudiation aspect is what says, I am who I say I am. In other words, that the traffic hasn't been, the integrity of that traffic is coming from a known entity. There's no, it's not a person other than that known entity. And that's the key area where they're going to compromise. Now, assuming that an API is properly designed is what developers do. They design an API to do what it's supposed to do. What they don't necessarily look for is it being used in a manner that was not prescribed? The worst things that I hate hearing from a developer are, well, you're not using it as designed. And that is precisely how the bad guys did it. They look at these APIs and how these applications talk to each other, and they use a variety of different techniques to guess as to how they're going to be able to break that API or make the API do something that it's not intended to do to gain escalated privilege or to gain access to the data. So what happens here is that because you're so deep into the programming language and into the programming protocols, most developers don't understand necessarily the security aspects of it and are trying to meet deadlines and trying to enable functionality, provide functionality. And then you have security folks who are security centric, and they may not have the knowledge, and I'm generalizing here because I know that there's exceptions to all of these, but I'm making broad generalizations. The security folks may not have the development knowledge to understand how an API itself works and what the underlying functions are that they could try to break. So what we need to make sure that we do is that we have security professionals or developers that understand each other's worlds. You have to have that level of expertise in both sides in order to be able to really be able to understand those vulnerabilities and be able to do penetration testing in those vulnerabilities. Some of the most common ways that APIs are attacked is you see these in poorly designed apps. They allow anonymous access. They use reusable tokens or reusable passwords. They would use clear text authentication or transmission of the content. Now, let me be very clear what I mean by that. A lot of folks rely on SSL as the mechanism for encrypting, authenticating, and non-repudiation across from a client to a server. That client can either be a phone, a web browser, an app, whatever that client may be. What I'm talking about here is not that SSL layer. That SSL layer may be just fine, and it ensures that you have a point-to-point encryption. However, as we've seen with Heartbleed and several other types of flaws in the implementation of SSL, that it is possible for these devices to fall back to ciphers and less secure methods. And that's one of the ways that hackers will exploit these. The key here is to transmit the actual content within that SSL tunnel in an encrypted manner, specifically if you're passing credentials one way or another. Another flaw in the apps is the inflexibility of access controls. You have a developer who will have very specific access controls. It's the first thing that they do when they set it up, and it basically just says, tell me who you are, authenticate, and that's it. You are now a user, and perhaps I'll have an admin interface that has slightly more rules than that, but that is then left. Those are the only two roles that you have. That's left as is, and there's no other way to change that. Applications need to have more flexible access controls in terms of the separation of duties and in terms of what they'll support for their authentication mechanisms and their certificate mechanisms. Improper authorizations, again, if you get into an application as yourself perhaps, and then you're able to escalate privileges to information that you're not authorized to access. And then the one I see so often is the limited monitoring or logging capabilities. You typically have these capabilities embedded in your in the server itself, whether it's the web server, if you're using an API firewall of some kind, a layer 7 firewall. All of these are fine logging capabilities, but you need to insert logging capabilities into the application itself so that, especially when you're doing administrative tasks, you can trace back exactly what the individual was doing, who was doing it, when they were doing it. And then you have to have monitoring of that. Having these logs collect and archive off into the future is part of that process. But if you don't have these logs being monitored, there's no way for you to detect whether an application is being used incorrectly. And more importantly, there's no way for you to detect whether somebody is probing your environment to try to find those flaws. So that's an important discrepancy to address. And then finally, there's unknown services or API dependencies. You may be dependent on other downstream connectivity, other downstream functions that you've embedded into your code. GitHub is wonderful in the sense that it provides all sorts of snippets of methods and codes and capabilities that people integrate all the time into their applications. And when they test it, they test within the application, but they never go back to test any kind of dependency that they may have on external APIs that they don't necessarily control, but that they're leveraging within the application. I'll give you an example. I know of banking pages that go out and provide you a location of all of their ATMs. Well, that's great, but on the back end, those ATM locations are actually being referenced through an API through a third-party provider that not only provides the maps, but also keeps the location record of where all those ATMs are, so that the bank doesn't have to worry about that. Of course, they know where that is, but it's probably in another department. It's probably not rolled into a database that's kept up to date. They leverage that information from someone else. Well, that dependency may cause you problems if you don't account for it as part of your penetration testing. So API security means authentication, appropriate access controls. I mean, authentication is saying who I am. Access controls is saying what I can do once I get in. Appropriate encryption at multiple layers, whether the information is at rest, whether the information is in motion, and in the tunnel that's connecting the device to the application. Most importantly, context validation. You see layer 7 firewalls out there. There used to be a company called Layer 7 Technologies. They got bought out by CA, and now their product is rolled in as their API management suite. I don't know how good the product is anymore, but in the past, that product itself did really good at interpreting the integrity and the structure of the messages coming through XML. And if they did not pass the integrity checks, they would be rejected. Because when you do penetration testing with techniques such as fuzzing, those will get caught very quickly with one of those types of firewalls. And then finally, activity monitoring. You must monitor your environment. I mentioned the CA API management suite. Apigee is another one. SOA software. And then IBM probably has some of the most robust tools out there that get really good at the monitoring and providing of web services. All right. The next big threat out there is account hijacking, and this is very similar to some of the other ones that we talked about. Again, account hijacking uses some of the previous two techniques, leveraging passwords as well as poor authentication and poor certificate management and poor key management. But one of the things that you see in account hijacking is not just the exploitation either by the exploitation of code or the exploitation of technology. The software exploits play heavily in it, but what you really start seeing in account hijacking is the use of more social engineering techniques such as phishing, other types of fraud. Those are all very valid, and in fact, if you look back at most of the, I would go so far as saying over 90% of the major hacks in the last 10 years have occurred mostly because of some level of hacking the human, the weakest link in the chain of security. Something as simple as shoulder surfing at Starbucks. I cannot tell you the amount of times I sit there working in Starbucks and I'm looking over and I can see screens of a particular individual, and I'll even angle my phone in a particular way next to my laptop, and I can sit there and record their sessions on their machines. I can't necessarily see what they're typing on their keyboards, but I can tell you, I can see where their fingers are placed, and pretty soon I can get that information. But I really don't bother with that anymore. Why not? Why have to when you can use a man-in-the-middle attack for Wi-Fi? This is another huge area where account hijacking is taking place. And I'm not just talking about hijacking your Twitter account or hijacking Instagram credentials or something like that. I'm talking about when your administrators or other folks are using these public areas, public Wi-Fi, to do a quick check because they just got a call from the boss. The boss says the server's responding slow. They go, hang on, I'm going to check it right now. And in this public environment, they're connecting into your infrastructure. And all of a sudden they've connected not through Starbucks Google or Google Starbucks account, but it's a Google Starbucks Executive Lounge SSID on their Wi-Fi. And I've seen that. I've seen these spoofed Wi-Fis, and you get access to your system, and everything works beautifully, just like normal. But there's somebody sitting in the middle of that connection that is grabbing all of the traffic. And even if your connection is encrypted, they're in the middle of that encrypted stream. They're seeing the clear text stuff come through. So it is a threat. It's something that as an enterprise, you probably will not be able to do too much about. I would recommend one of the strongest methods for this is to use, to prevent against that is, even if you're using a compromised environment, use a VPN. VPNs will encrypt the traffic and will pass, especially the reputable VPNs, those credentials in a secure way. They don't rely just on the point-to-point encryption. And VPNs will prevent a lot of this type of information from getting in the hands of the wrong people. And another account hijacking technique is to manipulate the actual web pages, the posts and the gets in the actual web page itself. You modify the data and then you submit that web page as if it came through from a valid user. Some of the things you need to look for are, does your service provider conduct background checks on their employees? Because you might have an environment that you're logging into and your employees are all locked down and they're beautiful and everything's great. But what about the service provider that you're using? What about that cloud service? I'll tell you that the reputable ones, the big ones, do conduct background checks and are pretty strong in their physical security. I would say that they're better, not just physical, but better secure in the way they handle their environments than most private enterprises. And not to toot anybody's horn, and they'll probably be hacked in the next few days by me saying this, but Amazon is clearly has a reputation based on the ability to provide a secure environment. So they're going to vet their employees. You've got Azure from Microsoft, you've got the Google environment, you've got the Apple iCloud. And all of these environments are brought to you by reputable companies. They're going to do the appropriate checks. They're going to secure their data centers. They're going to make sure that the people getting into those data centers don't have access to the servers without needing that access. That's not to say it's going to be perfect. It's just one layer and one thing you need to do. Again, multi-factor authentication, one-time passwords, very strong API authentication is important. If you're doing any kind of administrative access, restrict that administrative access from special workstation or to special workstations. Restrict your access to your cloud applications to certain IPs, perhaps from your corporate network or from specific VPN exit points. And encrypt that sensitive data, not just using the SSL, but use internal layer of encryption on the data itself and on the authentication credentials. Prohibit account sharing of those credentials. In a lot of systems, I noticed this in certain cloud services, they're not very mature. They only provide one account. They don't allow you to share, they don't provide multiple users for that account from an administrative access. When that happens, you got to share credentials. So who's going to be held responsible? The only way to hold somebody responsible is if you're monitoring that activity, you're monitoring the timestamps, and you can understand and make that link of who did what and when. So it's important that you have the appropriate monitoring in place. One of the biggest threats right now in account hijacking, and this will also show up in the malware when I talk about it, is also ransomware. You need to have good backups of your environment. Because an account that's been hijacked, if it's an administrative account, there's nothing to stop that individual from installing some sort of malicious code on there that will damage or lock up, encrypt your data with their own key, and then you cannot access it unless you pay them a ransom for it. So backups are important. Also restrict services and other functions and features that you're not going to have. It's nice to have everything under the sun because the provider provides it, But if you're not using it, if there's not a business case to use it, lock it down, because it's one less thing that you don't need to monitor or worry about as being a vector for hijacking your service. Some vendors that provide this very well, Formetric does a lot of the very good encryption. Cipher Cloud, very good. AWS VPCs, that's the virtual private connections, virtual private networks that AWS provides. Those are very, very good. They provide you direct access into your own cloud environment. They're not as good for public consumption, but they're very good for business to business type of activities and for enterprise to the cloud type of activities. And then finally, if you want to help deal with phishing, PhishMe is a good company that does awareness testing of your employees. You will see the scores improve over time, as well as a newer company out there called KnowBe4. All right, I mentioned ransomware. This has slowly become a bigger and bigger threat. Originally, I haven't been for many years very concerned about a lot of malware that's out there. It is concerning. You do clean it up pretty quickly once you detect it. Only about 20% of the malware out in existence today is actually detectable by most of the antivirus programs out there, because it takes very little changes to the actual source or even the binary form, changing certain bits. You can bypass many of the antivirus programs. The antivirus programs have gotten better, so those stats are getting much improved. But the one bit of malware that's out there is the ransomware. And ransomware can sit very quietly on your network and not do anything for a very long time. Therefore, it slowly gets rolled into all of your backups without you knowing it. And then it kicks off, begins encrypting your information. You raise up your hands, you say, oh my gosh, I've lost my data. And then the bad guy comes along with a pop-up on the screen or however their method is and says, if you want your data, pay us this much money in Bitcoin. And you send them the money. If you're smart, you get your data back. Problem is, in about a month or so or down the road, they may do it again if you haven't cleaned it up. And let's say you have cleaned it up. Let's say you've restored from a backup. Well, your backup is infected too, depending on how long that's been in there. So they're going to reactivate that same thing. So unless you detect it. The key here is to, ensure that you have backups of your information. And I can't stress this too much. A lot of companies will say, well, I've got backups. My backup strategy is I'm going to leverage the existing technology that I have to do the backup. So you rely on the cloud provider's ability to take snapshots, and you take multiple snapshots. That you're just taking a backup in one environment and backing it up to another area in the same environment. So snapshots aren't the only solution. It's the equivalent of making a tape of your data and then setting it next to the server. What you need to do is follow the good practices under disaster recovery and business continuity and test the methods. Can you restore a snapshot with the appropriate within the appropriate RTO and RPO, recovery time objective, recovery point objective? Is the data, and here's the key kicker in most of these restorations, is the data that you've restored synchronized appropriately between all the different applications and other cloud services that you may be using, so that you have referential integrity across the multiple databases? Because restoring from a backup isn't enough. You've got to make sure that that backup, at that moment in time that it was made, is synced up with the other environments that may not even be affected, but now the data that they have can't refer to the data in the backup because it's old data from a day ago, from a month ago. So really test your backups, test your integrated backups. Maintain multiple types of backups. Don't just do a full and then an incremental over a period of time. I know this is old tape type technology. Do full backups wherever possible. vary the timelines of those backups and vary the location of where you're storing them. And worst case scenario, use off-site storage, whether it's off-cloud storage or whether it's a second cloud provider that's not associated with your first cloud provider and doesn't leverage the same technology in any way, and back up to another cloud service. Nothing wrong with that. Make sure the backup is encrypted. Another important step there to avoid your permanent data loss. And distribute, if you're using AWS, distribute your data across multiple zones so that you don't have it all in one region. Because if there's a regional event on the internet and it affects a particular side of the country or a particular point in the country, you want to be able to switch your service and enable that service in another area. And just something to keep in mind, the new EU data protection rules, commonly called Privacy Shield, now they treat data destruction and data corruption of anybody's personal data as a breach, and it has to be reported. So it's something important. Remember this, the 3 R's of backups: rotation, retention, and remote. Keep it remote. Malicious insiders, we talked a little bit about that in some of the other scenarios. A lot of folks think it's not much of a concern, and it's definitely not exclusive to the cloud. This isn't something new. And a lot of folks don't think it's very serious. I mean, when you look at a CERT report from 2000 to 2012, the span of about 12 years, there were over a little bit over 700 confirmed reports of malicious insider incidents. That's just 700 across 12 years. Now imagine what wasn't reported. So these things do happen. The problem is that companies don't want to admit it, and they most certainly it will take steps to prevent it, but they also don't want to have a culture, their culture be impacted negatively by trusting or not trusting all of their employees. So it's a very sensitive type of scenario, but it's something that has to be addressed, has to be out in the open within the company at least, and treated with as much seriousness as an external person coming in. These malicious insiders aren't just in your company, but they could be out in the cloud providers themselves, and that's what you should be concerned about. Some of the things that may protect you against malicious insiders is, again, encryption or some form of obfuscation of the data. That could be, hashing with assault, tokenization, things that prevent the actual data from being seen by everybody, only the authorized. In the end, encryption is only one step. It's not going to be the final step, because really you have to ask yourself, who controls the keys? If your cloud provider controls the keys that you're encrypting, then you do not control that data. They do. And that may be a bad thing if they have a malicious insider. It may be a bad thing if they get compromised and then through their own internal functionality are able to access your data. It is very, very important that you keep that information to yourself and not allow your cloud provider to maintain it. What I have seen is third-party cloud providers, other cloud providers who manage those keys. So there's nothing wrong with having one cloud provider manage your entire PKI infrastructure with your certificates and your passwords and everything else, and then they provide, and then you have another cloud provider that actually provides the services that get those keys and that get that information from the managing provider. Now that's a separation of duties that really works well. Some other duties that you may want to separate are the monitoring and alerting of events, especially when you're talking about managing keys or changing passwords or accessing sensitive data. In some cases, those are our regulatory rules. Always use the two-man rule for administration. The two-man rule is that you break up functions so that two folks have to do a certain function to make it happen. The most famous thing that comes to mind are the two guys who sit in the bunker and have to turn the key at the exact time in order to launch a nuclear weapon. Well, you should be using something similar for very sensitive administrative roles. Have a two-man rule if you're going to be changing your password for administrative accounts, service accounts. If you're going to be updating certificates, have one person who does the private key, have another person who does the installation of the certificate itself. Those two-man rules aren't too intense in labor, but they do save you a lot of grief in the long term. Another area where you can stop the malicious insiders is to not allow administrators to use the administrative accounts in the cloud or on their own in their own native environments for everyday functions. Have a separate account that allows you to do those functions. Even if they work as an administrator all day, there are other techniques that you could use where they use their own account, but then have access to service to specific administrative services through specialized mechanisms. If you're a Linux administrator and you're in the shell, you know you can give root access to folks using sudo that lets them do the root function, the root privileged function, using their own credentials versus actually logging in as a root member. This is a breakout real quick here. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here of different ways that you could segregate administrative privileges at the application layer, the system layer, all the way up to the hosting layer. Very important set of segregation and a very effective method to ensure, or at least just another layer to protect you against malicious insiders. So I call them parasitic threats, advanced persistent threats. There's a lot of hype about these. They are important and deadly, and they sit in your environment. Basically what it is, they infiltrate and establish a foothold in your environment. This is a malware of some kind that then lies dormant, and it may collect intelligence over a period of time. And ultimately, it'll allow the bad guy, the fraudster, to move through your network using authorized credentials. So it's not somebody who's just in there not authorized. They get in through an authorized credential, and then they move laterally through your network using authorized credentials again. Ultimately, the goal is to get either to administrative access or to get to data through the current privileges that they have, and then collect that data and stealthily exfiltrate that data over an extended period of time. This is not theory. This is actually what's happened in a lot of companies. The problem is that the way, you keep hearing about these they used advanced techniques to hack X, Y, and Z. And really the advanced technique of the APT was secondary to the infection mechanism. Infection mechanism, phishing, spear phishing, where they target a particular individual from their information on LinkedIn. They understand the organizational structure, and they shoot that email out. Person clicks on it, they get infected. Then the bad guy is inside of his system now with authenticated and an actual privileged, or not privileged, but an actual user's authenticated credentials. And from there, they can go and get other things. This is very common, the way this happens. Now, APTs usually use a command and control tunnel that goes out to get its instructions as to what to download to do within your network, whether it just wants to do reconnaissance, whether it wants to transmit that data, or whether it wants to move laterally through your environment. That comes off through the command and control channel. Those command and control signals are sent through channels that are open inside of your network, whether it's DNS through port 53. I've seen that happen in port 53. For instance, I saw a case where the command and control was coming across port 53, and it was encrypted. And it would have been really easy to spot if the customer had egress filtering in their network, and all of a sudden they saw stuff and traffic on port 53 that was not normal. Encrypted data is a definite sign that something's not right. and also volumes. If you just all of a sudden start seeing a huge volume across a port that doesn't normally see normal volumes, you should be alerting on that. A couple of things real quick, and I'll move off of this because I don't want to beat this here. I think everybody gets it. Fish me, know before, that's good for phishing and awareness training. There's also some techniques you can use in your environment to reduce the opportunities for phishing. Those include domain-based message authentication, reporting and conformance. It's called DMARC, D-M-A-R-C. There's also SPF, sender policy frameworks that you can add to your DNS. And there's DKIM protocols, that's domain key identified mail. All of these will help prevent your own, from you receiving spoofed mail or other people using your domain to spoof users within your domain, and it does cut down on the phishing to a certain extent. Monitor for DNS tunneling, monitor for egress traffic. Behavioral analytics is a very good tool to help you see and spot lateral movement of validated employees who should be on your network, who are allowed to be on your network, but all of a sudden are moving through your environment in ways they never did before, using applications they never did before. All of those are behaviors that are indicative that something is different. There's different types of behavioral analytics, and everybody's claiming that they have it, but be very careful. You want to look at your users, basically identity-centric behavioral analytics. You want to look at their activity, which is action-centric behavioral analytics. There's file activity. What files are they accessing? That's asset-centric activity. And then finally, there's the method analysis, and that's what systems are being accessed. Is your admin, and I mean your administrative assistant, formerly called secretaries, are they accessing your server farm? Why? Why are they doing that? Those are things that you should be setting it off. And this is not just NetFlow, it leverages NetFlow, but it's providing contextual relevance to the normal data that you would see in a SIEM. Some vendors there are Interset, Exabeam, and ProtectWise provide really good behavioral analytics. And then for traffic and malware, Damballa, FireEye, Bluecoat, and ForcePoint, formerly known as WebSense. Those provide really good insights into the egress traffic and help you detect some of these APTs. This is just, I'm going to skip this, but it just shows how an APT works, what are the steps through reconnaissance and then moving into compromising and establishing a beachhead, and then you either exfiltrate through a command and control, you do lateral movements in the environment, and you move the data out. So something you might want to take a look at later on. All right, inadequate diligence. A lot of people move to the cloud, but they really haven't done their due diligence in analyzing who they're doing business with. And it's not just about who they're doing business with. You have to understand who your cloud provider is doing business with also. You know, you got to look at, you have to do due diligence to understand if your current security infrastructure is ready to support a cloud environment. The cloud providers do all the heavy lifting for you. They'll spin up those virtual servers, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't embed your own security capabilities within those virtual environments. It's about a shared responsibility there. A lot of companies are using DevOps, where there's an overlay of development and operations. It's no longer the development team develops, gives the code over to the operations team, and the operations team then publishes that code out into the production environment. It doesn't work that way anymore with DevOps. You've got developers who are spinning up instances, who maybe even in AWS, spinning up certificates with those instances. Who is monitoring that? Who is not getting in the way of it, but partnering with them to make sure that the appropriate due diligence is being done, that we know what is coming up and what's coming down in an environment, what the timing is, who's authorizing it. You've got to understand the state of your environment when you're out in the cloud. In addition, want to know what the data what are the data that will be pushed out into the cloud, what are the data flows, and what are the touch points within and outside of the application. In other words, how does the application itself go and touch that data, or how does some other external application go and touch that data? Basically, you're asking yourself, who will access what, when, and how? Very important in your due diligence. And then finally, the big due diligence is contractual considerations. Everybody knows that you want to put appropriate language in the contract related to liability and indemnification and insurance coverage, terms of renewal. What happens if the contract expires? Does your data disappear? Do they not give it back? Are you sure that they've given it all back, or that they've destroyed it, or is it sitting in some repository or sitting on a server waiting to be retasked for some other customer, but it's still out there somehow? You need to understand exactly what it means by destruction of data. Simple way to deal with that is if you're encrypting all your own data and they don't have the keys, if you withdraw access to those keys because you've severed your relationship with that cloud provider, that's called crypto shredding. You basically just shredded all the data that they have out in the cloud because there's no way to get to it without the keys, and especially if you throw those keys away. Intellectual property rights. You'd be surprised how many of these cloud services say they own your information or they own portions of your information if it's out in their environment. Make sure you understand exactly what services you're purchasing, who's going to be using those services, and how those services are managed. A lot of cloud services will say they're PCI certified. Well, yes, I'll give you a perfect example. Rackspace says they're PCI certified. They'll give you their ROC. They'll show it to you. The problem is they're PCI certified for the system that does their point of sale for e-commerce. Anytime you buy something, you get your credit card, all that's PCI certified. But the actual server where your virtual hosts are being hosted, where your actual domain is being fed through, that may not have been PCI certified. Don't know. You got to understand when a cloud vendor says they've done certain bits of compliance, where that compliance applies. Does it apply to the type of services that you will be using? It's very, very important that you work closely with legal and the business that's doing the leveraging of those cloud services so that you understand all of these. The slide deck, by the way, has a lot of notes to some 9 steps that you should follow in this area. I'm not going to dwell on it. Denial of service. This is not new. This isn't anything that anybody should be surprised about. It's an old disruptor, but it's still a threat, and it's more so in the cloud. And the reason is that a typical assault, a typical assault in the cloud for a denial of service won't just affect the individual being taken down. It will affect other services that are shared in that environment. There were a couple of large DDoS attacks. The largest one in history, well, at the time that I wrote this was in January 2016. It was 602 gigabits per second against a BBC site, which happened to take down the Trump site at the same time. They didn't intend to take down the Trump site at that time. They probably do now, but at that time when they took down the BBC site, anybody else who was leveraging their infrastructure, whether that was the network or whether that was the servers, were affected. I will tell you that I know of a company that was attacked by such a large denial of service attack that the infrastructure in the city where that company functioned and where they had their data center, other companies had degraded services or degraded services because all the carrier pipes into the city were consumed with the denial of service attack and the volume of that attack. So It's not just that you're being attacked, it's that somebody who's sharing that environment to be attacked. The collateral damage is big there. Now, the best way to deal with the denial of service is not that you're going to be able to prevent these things, but detection. Knowing how to detect as soon as possible is very important. I can tell you the detection, everybody says, oh, well, we'll know when we're attacked. Well, the reality is that you won't. The first thing that'll happen is you get customer complaints, or a web page doesn't show up right, or something's not working right. You get your alerts going off. And then the next thing that happens is you call up the networking team, and then they call up the application team, and then they may call up the server team. And everybody's looking at all of this, trying to figure out, are we running out of resources on the server? Yeah, you are. You are, because that's what a denial of service does. The key here is to identify that this denial of service is from an external source. That's the hard part. If you can do that, then you can go into your prevention and your response mode to put in filters and to mitigate. Some of the ways you mitigate is you diversify the pipelines into your network. You use multiple carriers, and those carriers have to have upstream connection points that are also diversified. It doesn't do you any good if you use 3 different carriers, but all 3 carriers go to the same connection point, and they aggregate in one pipeline over to May West or May East. It doesn't do you any good if May East or May West is attacked, and all of a sudden that becomes a choke point. So really look at the full cycle there. There are a variety of different types of attacks for DDoS. There's volumetric, where you just receive a lot of traffic through UDP floods, ICMP floods, or DNS amplification, other types of reflection attacks. Layer 3, again, SYN floods. Layer 3 is the modification of the packets so that they are corrupted, and they cause, you're basically exploiting the way the language of the internet works, TCP fragmentation and such. And then there's layer 7 attacks. These attacks actually affect the language, the logic behind an application. And I gave you that ATM analogy earlier on. There was actually an attack on a website that was taking down the website, and it turned out they weren't attacking the website at all. They were attacking the little widget that helped you find your ATMs. And that little widget was susceptible to these attacks because it had a flaw. But it had been missed because it was never looked at, because it was provided by an internal customer and rolled into the API. An external vendor rolled into the API, so it was never something that was dealt with internally, but it was the source of the attack. So you really need to look at that big picture and not narrow your focus. There's a couple good companies that help you in different layers of this. Akamai is huge for diversification, as well as Cloudflare. I will tell you that the biggest attack in history occurred with Krebs, and I think it was in the order of 620 or more gigabits per second. And Akamai, I think, was providing some sort of complementary service to Krebs, and they basically had to dump that because they were also overloaded. Arbor is another good tool that's used for protection. AT&T actually uses them. But again, if you have a big enough attack across some of these environments, these vendors are going to get overloaded too. There's also Black Lotus, who was acquired by Level 3. Prolexic was acquired by Akamai. GigaNet is out there in Capsula. Some of those will use BGP routing. Basically, they just create big shunts to dump the bad traffic. That's the image that you see there, is a traffic shunt that just takes the volumetric attack and dumps it. Others use filtering. They filter the traffic. The problem with filtering is that if you filter too tight, it's difficult to tell legitimate traffic from bad traffic. And all of a sudden, legitimate customers will start getting dropped connections. So you can't turn that filtering on all the time. But you should have an incident response plan that identifies that attack very quickly and then implements the filtering as soon as possible. There's several ways. There's one other thing I want to tell you anecdotally from my experience, and I can speak to this because it's been declassified. When the Iranians were attacking the U.S. financial services back in 2013, one of the things that became very apparent was that the financial system wasn't prepared to deal with this by itself. So literally, you would have CISO to CISO making phone calls to each other, passing the indicators of compromise, passing the signatures and the IP addresses of the traffic from the attack to each other, sharing it amongst each other, so that when the massive attack switched from that one bank to the other bank already had the protection, and the impact would be minimal. So response times went from 6 hours to 3 hours down to about 20 minutes. That was huge, because a 20-minute impact from detection to protection time is really very, very good. You need to have this practiced and ready to go. Media relations, third-party suppliers, your network team, your application team, your help desk, all of these folks should be involved in this. And finally, the last one, we're talking about shared technologies here. And shared technologies bring shared dangers. And you can see what I'm saying about all of these things in every one of these previous threats has this as the big cloud hanging over it. Multi-tenant environments share everything. And even if you have your own isolated environment, you're still sharing a data center perhaps, or you're sharing, even if it's a data center with your own cage in an environment. I mean, you're getting to the point where it's no longer a cloud at that point. The more you segregate, the more you lose the benefits of the cloud. But be aware that you are in a shared environment, and that when someone else who's on that shared environment gets taken down, there might be consequences. I will give you another example, a little story here. A KKK site, website was taken down by an activist, a hacktivist group. But it wasn't, that's what was thought originally. But what really ended up happening was the hacktivist group not only took them down, and they took down a few other companies that were on the site also. But then they used the attack, the distraction of a denial of service attack, to execute a penetration of the cloud service provider's environment, and were able to steal all of their customer information, including credit cards, accounts, and they basically were able to breach and steal all of that cloud provider's information. Now, in this presentation, in the notes, you'll note that there is a section I believe it's under the denial of service attack, where these type of blended attacks have occurred, and there's a case study in there that I put in there that shows how they used phishing, APT, denial of service, and finally, and hijack credentials to steal millions of dollars from the bank, from the company's bank. And this wasn't a bank attack. It was an attack against a company, and they were able to steal that from the company. The only thing that allowed that company to recover that money was that the bank's fraud system actually detected the transfer and stopped it before it occurred. The company was so concerned about their denial of service and so focused on it that they didn't see the thieves coming in through a variety of different other methods and getting into their environment. So anyway, that's just another example. Shared technology, shared dangers, defense and depth strategy is what you use there. This is not new. Multi-factor authentication, host-based and network-based intrusion detection and prevention. You can apply those out in the cloud. The concept of least privilege, again, the segregation of duties, segmentation of networks. So some solutions, if I was going to summarize all this up, go slowly, dip your toe in the water. The learning curve, with cloud adoption can be steep depending on how fast you go and how wide you go. So just take some baby steps, learn. Deploy certain applications out into the cloud or certain services, something as simple as file sharing, and lock it down. Figure out how to lock it down but still make it convenient. Once you learn those lessons, then start applying those to build policies, to build the how you're going to use the cloud, what the internal infrastructure is going to look like. Evaluate that internal infrastructure. Can it support cloud infrastructure? If not, then you need to factor those costs into what you're putting out there, because you're going to have to update your software. I see that happen often. Companies will move to the cloud, but they forget to actually factor in that they have to buy entirely new services or entirely new products for their security side. Be aware of what you have in the cloud, and really diversify your cloud providers wherever possible. I know it's wonderful to have everything in one bucket, and these cloud providers make it so easy. I truly love AWS and the way they integrate with DevOps, and you can just bring up a company so quickly and bring up an application and do things very quickly and make changes, and it's revolutionary. It truly is. But that's all great for a startup, and that's all great at a certain point, but if you're not diversifying some of those functions, ultimately, you may find yourself with all your eggs in one basket. Embrace a data-centric security model where you're protecting the data itself versus the endpoint. You can't control the endpoint. That's the BYOD. That's the Internet of Things. You can't control the server infrastructure. You don't own it. You can manage it to a certain extent, but if you control the data, you encrypt it, you manage the keys, you know who is accessing that data because you're monitoring it, and you have very tight authentication as to who can access that data. If you build your entire security strategy around that model, you will be able to enable the cloud, the Internet of Things, and the BYOD with minimal interruption. But I will tell you, it is not a panacea in the sense that you can't just do one thing. There's several things you need to do. It's defense and depth. And you're dealing with the two most dynamic things in your company, your data and your people. So it takes a lot more maintenance, and it takes a lot more, probably a larger department, probably more equipment to keep that going, but it will give you the ultimate level of protection. Due diligence, know your vendor, know who they are, know who else is using their services. To help you with due diligence, there's a couple of companies out there. There's a few that are actually going out and doing evaluations and collecting, you know, SSA 16 SOC 2s and SOC 1s and SOC 3s. They're collecting ISO 27000 certifications from them. They're PCI ROC, other types of assessments. These include Cloud Harmony, Cloud Security Alliance. One that I personally enjoy is Cloud eAssurance. They're very effective in evaluating these cloud providers and providing you with their evaluation of what they found, and you can leverage that information with your own assessment and to enable your use. Threat detection, very big. Understand when something is happening in the cloud and monitor it. Don't just assume that the responsibility is the cloud providers. The cloud provider's responsibility is to make sure that their environment that they're providing to you is functional, operational, and that they are secure on their back end for their administrative functions. What you do on your end is your business, and if you're not securing it and you're not protecting it, you're asking for trouble, right? And have a response plan for when things go wrong, and make sure that those response plans include your cloud providers, multiple cloud providers, the ones who are providing those extra APIs that may not be provided, let's say, by AWS. They may be provided by other companies. Include them in your discussions about crisis management. And what would you do if there was a problem? Who would you contact? Do you have those lists? Do you have any kind of priority if there is an event, so you don't get stuck in queue and trying to find press 3 and please listen to this message, because options have changed. Figure out what to do so you can respond very quickly. And again, you got to strike a balance between privacy and security, especially with the new EU rules. You got to make sure that you're monitoring, but you also have to make sure that you're monitoring within reason. All right, last slide here that I thought was important. Around 2013, it came to Gartner's attention. of these new types of capabilities called CASBs. CASBs are, and that's just the way I call them, they're actually cloud access security brokers. And what they really are appliances or services that provide you with multiple capabilities to protect data in the cloud. They will provide single sign-on and identity access, multi-factor authentication through a variety of different protocols. They will help you with unmanaged devices so that you can manage the data on those devices. They will help you with managed devices so you can manage the device itself and keep it up to date. They will encrypt the data in motion. They will encrypt the data at rest. They will also provide some of the more sophisticated ones. You're seeing this now in this next generation, more security for the API, as well as the ability to the ability to manage your encryption keys and manage your certificates. So CASBs are like this holy grail, this thing that does everything. In reality, if you look at some of the vendors that Gartner is starting to put on the market analysis, some of these vendors go back to 2011, 2009, and what they really are is your traditional enterprise security products that have now turned them into cloud-based products also, so that they're not in the cloud per se, but they can manage things in the cloud. Some of them are very good. Netskope is good. Sky High Networks, Big Glass, another big player in that world. Zscaler, Cipher Cloud, I mentioned them before, and Percepsys, which was bought by Blue Coat. That's another one that's out there. There are a lot more out there. This is a growing market. It's probably going to be, this is my prediction, one of the fastest and biggest growing areas in the security world, probably under the guise of quote unquote threat analysis or threat intelligence, because everything is about a threat now, whatever the catchphrase happens to be. But just look for that. Look for CASBs. These aren't cheap, but they do provide a variety of solutions to get you going out in the cloud and to give you a certain level of security. And they may help with some of the regulatory issues that you have. Closing thoughts. Summarizing the risks in the cloud under three things is the multi-tenancy. You have a shared responsibility. A multi-tenancy is there's other people on there. The shared responsibility is that you have to protect your stuff and the cloud provider has to protect some of the things. And perhaps your customers and or your employees have to do a certain level of protection too. And finally, compliance, getting by the regulators and proving to them that you have taken appropriate due diligence in this environment is difficult, but it is doable. Work with your cloud providers to give you that. So does anyone really believe that there is a perimeter, that it still exists? Because I will tell you that based on this presentation, based on the reality that I see on a daily basis out there, there isn't a perimeter. We think there is because we still use VPNs and we still use firewalls, and we try to imagine that as being a perimeter. But I like to think about it as more of a chain link fence, okay? It is a perimeter of sorts, but it is full of holes. And you really can get something through it, over it, under it, if you try. And unless you're monitoring and you have multiple layers of defense behind that chain link fence, it doesn't matter if you're in the cloud or in your enterprise environment, you're going to have a problem. So don't think of the perimeter as a solid wall anymore. Think of it as a chain link fence. Defense in depth, as I just said, remains that key security strategy. And if you only had the money to focus on three things, you couldn't buy a CASB, you couldn't deal with everything. Classify your information. That means know what your data is, or your data are, sorry, and ensure that you know who will be using it and where they will be using it and how. All right, that is part of information classification. Very, very important. You can't protect it if you don't know what it is. And I can't tell you the number of times I've asked that question. So what are you putting out in the cloud? And they'll give you a couple things, and then you do an analysis and you discover about 100 other things they didn't know were out there. Encryption. Very important. Encryption at rest, encryption in motion, and not just SSL. Encrypt the tunneled data also if you have to. And by encryption, I mean obfuscation, true encryption, tokenization, other types of techniques. And then finally, privileged access management. You want to manage all your accesses, but if there's one kind that's so important, it's anything that's privileged that allows certain types of functions. You've got to know what they're doing. You got to know who's doing it, and you've got to log that information. All right, that's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bobby. I want to thank everybody for attending. We have some links below for additional content that you can download, and please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Again, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today, and please look forward to additional webinars in this series. Thank you again.